Here we go. Okay, so this week's material, as I said, oral speech for my own oral speech is already failing me. It's been a long day, folks. Okay, that happens sometimes. I'll be honest. Probably a good point to touch on before we go too much further is that thing around. So professional singers, serious musicians will spend time before they perform doing what's called warming up. Now, in terms of instrumental players, that literally means actually playing their instrument because a warm instrument plays differently to an instrument you just pick up and play right away. So even like a guitar, for example, playing the strings quite a bit will generate heat in the strings, and then you need to adjust them to get the pitch right before you actually play it. Because if you play it cold, the pitch will change. But it's the same with vocal performers, particularly singers, is to do some vocal exercises first to kind of get your vocal cords warm and ready to go. There are things that various people do, and you can look up that sort of stuff online around vocal exercises to help warm up your voice. If you're preaching, and particularly if you're like me and it's Sunday morning and it's 8 o'clock, and I might not have gone to bed quite as early as I should have on Saturday night, and it might be winter and my voice is a bit croaky, actually spending a bit of time using your voice before you actually have to do that is a helpful thing because voices do get tired and we can crackle and voices can break and these sorts of things. It is part of the performance, is to think about actually getting your voice ready to do it well. The other thing when we're tired, and you heard me just do it, and it's a giveaway that I am tired, is that I trip over words. If I have complicated words, my tongue might just not quite get around the vowels or the consonants of the word. And a good practice for that reason is to use simpler words when speaking. That's kind of one of our first key points is simple language, easier for you to say and easier for people to understand. Sometimes we need to use longer, more complicated words, but sometimes, and each of us are different. Each of us will find there are particular words that we trip over or we stumble on. There's a word that messes with me in preaching when I talk about the word is society, society. And if I'm not paying attention, I trick myself into thinking I haven't pronounced that word correctly because there's the double S sounds. I can suddenly go, did I just say society or did I just say society? Because it's a word I trip up on. So because I know that about myself and I sometimes freak myself out about, did I just pronounce society right? And I'm thinking this as I have just read it out to the congregation and I'm carrying on with something else. That becomes a stumbling block for me. It's better off that I talk about things like community instead. I don't have that problem with that word. It's just a little vocal hang up that I have with that particular word. Another word that I find, which I use way too much, but I find difficult, is the word similarly, as in something is similar to. Similarly, but because of that, again, the L sounds all close together, I can trip over that word. And if it's early on a Sunday morning, I say similarly instead of similarly. So I have to be really conscious of saying that word correctly because I often stumble on it. The better thing is to go, oh, I realize either I've got to find a way of dealing with that word well, going, I see that word's coming up and I need to really hit it well. And there are different tricks, maybe I'm going to put that word into bold so that when I'm reading my text, I can see it's there and I can go, yeah, that's that word I need to be careful of. Or italics or whatever makes it noticeable. Or I need to go, that's right. It's just one of my problem words, and maybe I need to use a different phrasing or a different word to do it. And sometimes it's only when we say things, because when we write an essay and we're used to writing assignments for our papers here at college, and we're used to using some sort of fancy technical words, and we write them and we don't ever read our assignments out for the most part. We just hand them in and they get marked and someone else reads them. It all all of the literacy, all of the reading and engagement happens in our heads. It's different when we speak. And this is why rehearsing our script, preparing our words and rehearsing it, that's where sometimes we're going to say, oh, yeah, that sentence is actually clunky. It's hard for me to say. And so again, shorter sentences, which is a way of sharpening up our ideas, but it's also breath. We only have so much breath. We need to be able to get all the way to the end of the sentence. We need to have gaps in the right places. But mostly, it needs to be easy for us to say the things that we need to say. And this only comes with practice, really. Sometimes we have very long sentences, but again, we've got to remember we're not all German theologians who like to write an entire page worth of text and then they put full stop at the end and they go, well, this makes sense in German. I preach in English. I know some of you will preach in other languages, but these rules kind of apply to a lot of these things, The job of preaching is I speak and you listen. And so I need to speak in ways that make it easy for you to listen. And the more simply I speak, the better that is. And I've already just done a whole bunch of other great demonstrations of things I shouldn't do. I talk too fast when I'm here in class. I get excited. I've got lots of thoughts I'm trying to get across to you. And I can speak too quickly. Preaching, need to slow the pace down a little bit. Sometimes I need to be prepared to go, and I'm going to have a pause here. I'm going to give everyone a moment to think about what I just said. Okay? Because that helps with communication, right? Because all of these are intentional choices that we have to make, and we have to start thinking about that. It's not just me doing a good presentation, me having done my work well. It's also going, how much am I helping my listeners to take this in? There are other parts of this we need to consider as well, which is some of you will be like me. I used to be in my previous church. It was not massive. It was a good size, but let's say there was a power cut and I didn't have any microphones or speakers or anything. My previous church was small enough that if I speak in my speaking voice, everyone was going to be able to hear me fine. Okay, so I could fill the space with my voice without a microphone. In the church I'm in now, I can't do that. It's too big. The building is just too big. Roof too high, too far. And in fact, when I speak, when I finish a sentence, I hear my echo moving down the building. It's such a large building, okay? And the thing about knowing that I'm in that space means I have to slow down, okay? Because the bigger the acoustic, the bigger the space you're trying to fill, the slower you have to talk, because you have to give your voice time to move from the front of the congregation all the way to the back. If we speak too quickly in that environment, it becomes impossible to hear. It just becomes noise at a certain point. So again, these are just a couple of little tips. Anyway, I've probably said about 15 things I've already got in the slides. So I'm going to move to the slides now. Any questions about any of those things? Any points of clarification before we jump on in to other things? Okay. Once again, I already talked about my good habits, telling you what we're going to do this week. I've already told you about 4 times these are the things we're doing. Right, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to show you a short video clip from someone talking about language and their use of language and the enjoyment of speaking. We might watch this a couple of times potentially. It's just a rant he's on, to be honest. He's having a bit of a rant. But this is someone who is known well for their ability to speak publicly in an entertaining way. So this person is Stephen Fry. Some of you might know who he is. He's an English comedian. He's an actor. He's appeared in all sorts of things. He was in the Hobbit movies, I think, here in New Zealand. But he's certainly known for being quite an articulate person. And this is him talking about the use of language. So we'll watch this video and then we might have a quick debrief and then we might watch it again. Here we go. Let's see if my video works.
For me, it's a cause of some upset that more Anglophones don't enjoy language. Music is enjoyable, it seems, so are dance and other athletic forms of movement. People seem to be able to find sensual and sensuous pleasure in almost anything but words these days. Words, it seems, belong to other people. Anyone who expresses themselves with originality, delight, and verbal freshness is more likely to be mocked, distrusted, or disliked than welcomed. The free and happy use of words appears to be considered elitist or pretentious. Sadly, desperately sadly, the only people who seem to bother with language in public today bother with it in quite the wrong way. They write letters to broadcasters and newspapers in which they are rude and haughty about other people's usage, and in which they show off their own superior knowledge of how language should be. I hate that, and I particularly hate the fact that so many of these pedants assume that I'm on their side. When asked to join in a "let's persuade this supermarket chain to get rid of their 5 items or less" sign, I never join in. Yes, I am aware of the technical distinction between less and fewer, and between uninterested and disinterested, and infer and imply, and all the rest of them, but none of these are of importance to me. None of these are of importance, I said there. You'll notice the old pedantic me would have insisted on none of them is of importance. But I'm glad to say I've outgrown that silly approach to language. Oscar Wilde, and there have been few greater and more complete lords of language in the past 1,000 years, once included with a manuscript he was delivering to his publishers a compliment slip in which he had scribbled the injunction, "I'll leave you to tidy up the woulds and shoulds, wills and shalls, that's and whiches, etc." Which gives us all encouragement to feel less guilty, don't you think? There are all kinds of pedants around, with more time to read and imitate Lynn Truss and John Humphreys than to write poems, love letters, novels and stories, it seems. They whip out their sharpies and take away and add apostrophes from public signs, shake their heads at prepositions which end sentences, and mutter at split infinitives and misspellings. But do they bubble and froth and slobber and cream with joy at language? Do they ever let the tripping of the tips of their tongues against the tops of their teeth transport them to giddy euphoric bliss? Do they ever yoke impossible words together for the sound sex of it? Do they use language to seduce, charm, excite, please, affirm and tickle those they talk to? Do they? I doubt it. They're too farting busy sneering at a greengrocer's less-than-perfect use of the apostrophe. Well, sod them to Hades. They think they're guardians of language. They're no more guardians of language than the Kennel Club is the guardian of dog kind. And the worst of this sorry bunch of semi-educated losers are those who seem to glory in being irritated by nouns becoming verbs. How dense and deaf to language development do you have to be? If you don't like nouns becoming verbs, then for heaven's sake avoid Shakespeare, who made a doing word out of a thing word every chance he got. He tabled the motion and chaired the meeting in which nouns were made verbs. I suppose new examples from our time might take some getting used to. He actioned it that day, for instance, might strike some as a verbing too far, but we've been sanctioning, envisioning, propositioning and stationing for a long time, so why not actioning? Because it's ugly, whinge the pedants. Well, it's only ugly because it's new and you don't like it. Ugly in the way Picasso, Stravinsky and Eliot were once thought ugly, and before them Monet, Mahler and Baudelaire. Pedants will also claim, with what I'm sure is eye-popping insincerity and shameless disingenuousness, that their fight is only for clarity. Well, this is all very well, but there's no doubt what, for example, 5 items or less means. Just as only a dolt can't tell from the context and from the age and education of the speaker whether disinterested is used in the proper sense of non-partisan or in the improper sense of uninterested. No, the claim to be defending language for the sake of clarity almost never ever holds water, nor does the idea that following grammatical rules in language demonstrates clarity of thought and intelligence of mind. Having said this, I admit that if you want to communicate well for the sake of passing an exam or job interview, then it's obvious that wildly original and excessively heterodox language could land you in the soup. I think what offends examiners and employers when confronted with extremely informal, unpunctuated and haywire language is the implication of not caring that underlies it. You slip into a suit for an interview and you dress your language up too. You can wear what you like linguistically or sartorially when you're at home or with friends, but most people accept the need to smarten up under some circumstances. It's only considerate. But that's an issue of fitness, of suitability. It has nothing to do with correctness. There's no right language or wrong language any more than there are right or wrong clothes. Context, convention and circumstance are all. I can't deny that a small part of me still clings to a ghastly Radio 4 newspaper letter writer pedantry, but I fight against it in much the same way I try to fight against my gluttony, anger, selfishness and other vices. I must confess, for example, that I find it hard not to wince when someone aspirates the word, and it is a word, H-A-I-T-C-H.
So yeah, it's quite overwhelming. As I say, it's quite a rant. Like, you wouldn't preach like this. Like, as a video clip, it kind of works. It's a particular medium, but again, to take it all in, you need to really watch it multiple times to actually get a sense of what he's talking about. So he's talking about language conventions, but there are a couple of sort of key points I think are worth taking out of it, which is that, you know, he makes that point around dressing our language up. There is that thing of not being like preaching. There is a formality to it. You know, it's part of a liturgical event. It's set within a service of worship, and there's a certain amount of, you know, preparing well shows that you respect the role and the position that you're in as the preacher. So a certain amount of attention, and that includes speaking to the best of our ability. And part of that is preparation, is to write things well and to have rehearsed and to put our best foot forward. It doesn't mean, and again, I try not to get too hung up on grammar either. As I say, I've given you a couple of pointers around shorter sentences tend to work quite well. And again, you know, when certain people that I talk to my sermons about read them and they go, oh, you know, grammatically that's not correct. And I say, yeah, but it's not about whether it's grammatically correct. It's about how people are going to hear it. And I write for how I'm going to speak it and how people will understand it. And that there are lots of language conventions that we can get hung up on. But again, it's remembering what is the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise is to communicate well, not necessarily to have written the most eloquent English essay ever. It's to get the message across and to get it across easily. Anything in that video that anyone else picked up on that they want to just comment on or ask about?
I mean, it's a wonderful play of words. He's such a clever man, but I think even the way he mentioned context, that's the big thing for me. It's very different to write an essay than writing a homily. And a homily, I've just written one for this, my third only homily for this coming Sunday. And I'm really aware I haven't written it like an essay, because I'm going to speak it, and therefore it's shorter. It's choppier, it's broken up. I'm pausing, and all those things that you wouldn't do in a normal essay, because it's verbal, and it's, like you said, which is to be heard. So I'm really aware of that. And when I look at it as a piece of writing, part of me is horrified, because I wouldn't write like that normally. But I know that I'm deliberately written it to be heard, to be listened to, and so it's a different context altogether. I love Richard Fry. He's marvelous. Stephen Fry, he's a marvelous man. Wonderful words.
Yeah. And I like that he points out, because he is one of those people, because of his he's very gifted with language. He really enjoys using language, and he and he's good at it. But I always assumed that he was quite pedantic, that he would be one of those people who is very hung up on. I mean, he uses that he talks about the difference between, he says, people putting out signs which say 5 items or fewer. And what he's pointing to is that There is a difference between the word fewer and the word less. So 5 items or less. Well, the word less in that sentence actually means about a volume of things. So you can have less water. I have a jug full of water. I drink some. Now there's less water because it's sort of 1 unit. But when it's discrete items like a pile of bananas, you wouldn't say there are less bananas. You'd say there are fewer bananas, because fewer designates that there are lots of different bananas and you've taken some away. And so it's a really particular distinction in language that some people get very, very hung up on, and most of us actually don't care, because we know that if we say 5 items or less, we know what's meant. There are other examples of that where the words don't quite make sense, but we know what someone means. The classic one when I was at school was someone said, I haven't done anything. I haven't done anything. How do you understand that? Am I saying that I've done something? No. So that sentence, I haven't done anything, if we actually break it down and say, what does that sentence mean? It actually means if I say I haven't done anything, I'm saying I have done something. That's actually what the words mean, but that's not how we interpret it, right? I haven't done anything. You're hearing me say, I'm claiming that there is something that I haven't done anything, or I haven't done nothing, these sorts of experiences. So we've just got to be careful that, as I say, we can get hung up on those phrases. And if we break them apart, we can go, well, that double negative, I haven't done nothing. I haven't done nothing means you have done something. Yeah, sorry, it was not I haven't done anything. Whereas you mean I haven't done anything, but I haven't done nothing. That means you've done something. Terrible example. I totally botched it. Anyway, you get what I'm saying. The point is we have lots of language conventions, which they might, if we write it out as a sentence, we go, hang on, this is confusing, or it's not clear, or they seem to be saying the opposite of what they were trying to say. But actually we understand it. We understand what's being said because communication is more than just the words. It's actually the body language and the way that I've said it, and it's all of those things too, a part of how we communicate. Anyway, that's cool. We'll move on from that stuff. As I say, I think I put the video on the Moodle page, so you can go back and have a look. Right, here's a thought. Language constructs reality. What do you think I mean when I say language constructs reality?
Language creates something real because it fixes it. By calling something or by saying a word, you place it and you fix it into what's real, into reality.
Yeah. Can you think of an example of where that might be?
By saying, somebody is.
Yeah, go for it. I'll put you on the spot.
Yeah, by saying somebody is a good person, you're defining them, and therefore, I don't know. That's not working now. Oh gosh, I don't know.
That's right. I've got some examples. So, quite a number of years ago, I was staying with an uncle of mine, and I had been caught out in the rain and didn't have a jacket. Came home to his place, and I was just absolutely drenched. I was absolutely soaking. And I came in the door, and he said, "How was your day?" He just said, "How was your day?" And I went, "Absolutely crap. What an absolutely crap day." And he looked at me and he just said, "Nah, it's just bad weather." Okay. So you hear the language that I use said, the question was, how was the day? Well, I answered it talking about the weather. I was soaking wet. And I said, the day was crap. All of it's crap. I just wrote off the whole day because I was wet. And he just said, no, just bad weather. So he offered a different construction of reality where it's like, no, don't say the whole day's bad because you were wet. Actually, and he said that later on. He said, no, come on, the day's what you make it. I'm like, oh, that's right. So I shifted my perspective. So just those little things around language can make a big difference. For those of you who have done a bit of pastoral theology work, this is one of the things that comes up in narrative counseling. Okay, what narrative counseling focuses on is the idea that how I tell my story can change my experience of that story. Okay, so and it means that I might have a particular way of telling my story, or I might say something, or I might believe something about myself. I'm a loser. That's my story. I'm a loser. Everything I do is crap. I suck. Okay. Narrative therapy is about saying, if that's the story you're going to tell about yourself, that's what you're going to believe about yourself. And that's going to be your reality. But narrative therapy says the good news is that you can start telling a different story about who you are. And tell it differently. So I'll give you a more tangible example of that. When I left this college just over 20 years ago and went to my first ministry placement, and I was meeting the leadership team there, and they said, "Oh, Richard, it would be great if you could tell us about yourself." I said to them straight up, well, the first thing you need to know about me is I'm a university dropout. Now, the truth is, I had dropped out of university 6 years before that from my first degree. I did leave my first degree. When I started at university the first time, started studying a degree in music. After 2 years, I worked out that wasn't for me. And I went and traveled for a while, and then I came back and I started university again. And then I did complete all my qualifications that second time. So 6 years had happened, and I suddenly went, hang on. For the last several years, ever since I dropped out of university, I've been telling a story that I'm a university dropout. But actually, I now had, at that point in time, 2 degrees. I wasn't a university dropout anymore. And it was just a moment where I went, hang on, I need to tell the story differently now. Because this is constructing reality. It's constructing people's perception of who I am. And actually, I don't need to tell my story that way anymore. I can actually just say, well, actually, I've just finished these qualifications. That should have been how I did that. But because I've been living that experience so long of feeling ashamed of myself and not having completed this qualification, I felt that it was a black mark against me. That was what I presented. And then I got seen that way. So it was a moment where I suddenly caught myself and went, okay, I've got to change how I tell the story now. And I stopped telling that story at that point in time. And in fact, at this point in time, like lots of people don't finish things. That's actually okay. I don't feel ashamed about that anymore. It's part of my journey. But that's what this point is getting at. Language constructing reality. The way I tell the story is going to shape my experience of it. Because, oh, sorry, I lost that thought. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Right. So
I've actually got an example now. I was thinking about sales of glass half full, glass half empty. That's a good example of how you perceive things as either half full or half empty. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So here we go. Whether you say you can or whether you say you can't, you are right. Henry Ford. It's a nice quote. It's about, and again, it's that thing of our attitude, and that very much is that pessimistic versus optimistic attitude. I work, as I say, heck, I'm a Gen Xer. We're naturally cynical and skeptical. That's kind of what my generation is. So my optimism has been hard won in terms of having to change the way I talk about the world and daring to think, actually, maybe, we can have a more positive spin on things. So that is a good example of that. So again, being careful about the way we approach things. And often in church, we can really easily slip into traps of talking about things in a negative way where it is possible to talk about those things in a positive way. Like a great example around this is from time to time, we have to address things like church finances. And it's a really hard thing, especially if your church finances are decreasing and you're feeling a pressure. It's really easy to get stuck into that negative thing. We're facing some tough choices, everyone. We might have to close this ministry unit. Ooh, that's not particularly hopeful. But saying, everyone, here's the reality of the situation. We've got less money, but there's an opportunity for us to come together, and what are we going to do about it to help turn this around? Because there are things that we need to do, and there are other ways of framing that stuff that are more positive. And it's hard to do in some of those situations because, as I say, often we can focus on the problem rather than seeing the opportunity. So these are just other things to think about as in terms of how we speak about a particular issue in our preaching is going to shape people's experience of that issue. So this is a little bit of a parody. It makes me laugh because I can recognize the truth of this from when I was a young Christian in my teens. So what the cartoon says, it says, if we talked to people the way we talk to God. And so this young man is saying, Emily, wife, could you just pick up some milk, Emily, wife, while you're at the store? Just go ahead, Emily, wife, and just go to the milk section, Emily. Just grab some milk, Emily, and just place it right in your cart, wife. Emily, wife, just thank you, Emily, wife. Okay. Some of you might recognize a particular kind of prayer style. I encountered this when I was, part of evangelical Pentecostal churches when I was sort of 15, 16, 17, that this is a way of talking to God. And it was kind of, Father God, just do this, Father God, So I recognize that from my own experience. And it's not really taking the mickey, but it is that thing of thinking about how we use language in prayer. And the thing that I've learned, particularly in prayer, is when I talk to God, I speak to God as I would speak to anyone here, again, because this changes my experience of God. But I've, when I had particular sort of learnt prayer patterns, which is what happened in my church, they became problematic. They became a barrier to understanding and experiencing God more deeply. When I started talking to God as if God was a friend, more relational, and that I speak to God the way I speak to anyone, it changed my experience of God, okay? And that God becomes a different reality. The other thing is, the way we name God is going to shape our experience of God. When I grew up, the only name for God that was ever used was Father. And that shaped my experience of God because that was how I came to understand God. But I moved away from that in my 20s. And for a long time, I replaced Father with just God. So, and my experience of God changed as a result. And often these days I will actually play to God as mother of us all, which again has changed my experience of God. It helps me understand more of what God is. So as I say, the way that we name God in our prayer life really can shape our experience of what God is. And if we only ever use the same names for God, we're only going to ever experience God in the same ways. So sometimes part of our role as preachers is to speak in God in different ways, more expansive ways. And yes, I'm going to challenge you all. Sometimes those might be feminine ways, which lots of us are not used to. It hasn't been part of our experience of God growing up or in our church communities. It is not a bad thing. And all I would just suggest to you at this point is, even if you're not prepared to do it in your church context or in your preaching, maybe just try it in your own prayer life and see what it does for you. Give it a try. See if your experience of God shifts if you try naming God in a different way. The Bible is full of names for God. So find one you haven't used before and see if it changes your perspective. If you don't like it, you can go back to naming God the way you always have. No rules, but I'm just saying, just try these things, because the point is, the way we use our words does change our experiences. That's what I'm really pointing to here. Can see this next slide coming up, and I'm trying really hard to remember why I've put it in. I might have spoken about this before. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so I have
Oh, yes, you have.
There you go. I've already stealing from myself in the future. What a terrible thing to do. So yeah, I have talked to you about this of understanding God in different ways, and this was a fun one of talking about the idea of what if we imagine ourselves as an unborn child that is held within God's love, like an unborn child is held in the womb. Because the womb is a safe place, it's a nourishing place. It's a place where we are utterly surrounded by another human being, our mother. And what if we, again, so I've used this image to suggest, what if God's love is like that? And it's an idea for me that changed my relationship with God. Of wow, what an idea! Of like maybe I'm about to come to birth in a new way, and that God is the one nurturing me for that. Because as I say, I grew up with a God, and my understanding of God was that God was kind of looking at me all the time and was always a little bit disappointed with me. That was how I experienced God. That I was always just, if I was doing something naughty, God was watching. And God was keeping track. Richard, you swore at your parents when they weren't listening. That was how I understood God, was that I was about to kind of get in trouble. These sorts of ideas change that. They change it. It's a different way of understanding it. Saying, oh, actually, that's right. God is loving and nurturing and caring. And there are times where I want to say things like, God looks at me and says, actually, Richard, you're pretty good. Now, I can say that, but I don't quite believe it because I still have that idea deep down in me that God thinks I'm a bit naughty and is a little bit disappointed in me. But thinking about these ideas helps a lot. It helps give another idea of what God might be like. And the more I think about it, the more I realize actually God is more like this than what I thought God was like when I was 5, 6, 7 years old. But that stuff's still there. It's still part of me too. Any thoughts or comments about that before we jump on in to another idea?
It's a lovely image. I think it's a really effective image.
Yeah, it's profound.
It's a lovely image, yeah.
The thing that really got me about sharing this one, and I shared this in a sermon, and this was the exact picture I used, and I shared it. And I had a retired priest in my parish who was in his 80s, who having sort of spoken a little bit about this at that, and he just said, I've been waiting my whole life to hear this sermon, and it gave him permission to give words to something that he had always felt, but he himself had never been prepared to say, which was, for me, quite a profound experience to go, oh, wow, okay. Heck, I hope when I'm 80, I'm still getting surprised and excited about new ideas about what God might be like. Another thought, do the words you use invite listeners into the sermon? So, yeah, being aware that relying on the same God language all the time might become a barrier. If we only ever speak about God in the same way over and over again, that might be a barrier for some people. And that's sometimes varying, and naming God in different ways can become invitational, can be an opportunity for people to engage in a new way with you. But language goes further than that. Here I'm really thinking about that idea of being persuasive. Again, you think of that, not to revisit the well too many times, but when Peter Jackson was telling us about these films that his mother had told him he would find at the neighbor's house and what they he's using in his voice in a way that's encouraging people to listen and engage. So sometimes thinking about how we use our voice in terms of what we might be suggesting. I'll give you 2 weird examples of this, okay? In terms of how we might vary our voice. So, terrible example. In the world of professional wrestling, because I watched professional wrestling in the 80s when I was young. And most professional wrestlers get up and scream, you know, Friday night, I'm going to see you. You know, it's this sort of approach, right? And that's what happens in professional wrestling. Most do that. Except there was a wrestler when I was a kid. He was called Jake the Snake Roberts, and he did the exact opposite. And he spoke very quietly. And when he spoke really quietly, it's like you have to lean in and listen, okay? And so he was actually a more effective because he was different to what everyone else did. In the place, in an environment where everyone's used to yelling and doing big, he went small and quiet. The other comparison I'd give to that is that idea of if you're, sitting around a fire and there are kids and you go, oh, let's tell a ghost story. How are you going to tell a ghost story to kids? Are you going to yell and scream and be loud or be boisterous or be happy? No, you're going to be quiet and whisper and, because that's how we get engaged with that sort of material. Now, preaching doesn't tend to be like telling a ghost story, but sometimes we need to take the level down in order to draw people in a little bit more. It's not a technique I use a lot, but it's a good thing to be aware of. Because again, if your style as a preacher is that you tend to do, big hand gestures, you make a lot of eye contact, you use your voice loudly, these are the things that I tend to do. Sometimes try the opposite. Again, because the opposite might convey something else, might give people a different experience of you as a preacher, and it might convey something else. So just think about those particular dynamics of how you might engage people. As I say, I've hit the point over and over and again throughout the course, but stories can really, really help. Good stories get buy-in. They get people to listen and engage. And a well-told story is even better. Great storytellers, you want to listen to them. It becomes secondary what they're actually telling you. It's the fact that they're able to tell stories well. So I've touched on this point a little bit as well. So the KISS rule, keep it simple, stupid, or keep it stupidly simple, which is nicer because it's not actually an insult. But keep it simple, stupid. You can see there's just a bunch of technical words there. Immunocompromised, phylogenetics, sociopolitical, interdisciplinary. Okay, not all of these words are necessarily terrible, but jargon words can be, oh no, I'm going to get to jargon yet, but sometimes long, complicated words, sometimes they can be really helpful because sometimes when you need to use specific words to talk about specific things, and that's true. But sometimes we can use simpler words to say exactly the same thing as the complicated word does. If I tend to use a complicated word that people aren't familiar with, but I'm wanting to use it, I will explain what the word means. A little example of this, not that this is a word I use, but back when I studied music, that degree I told you I dropped out of, but there was a very popular word. I was writing music, I was just studying composition, and the word that got used all the time by everyone is juxtaposition. Have you heard this word? Juxtaposition. And everyone say, oh, well, this is the juxtaposition between this and this. Now, what it means really, the word juxtaposition, it means I've got one idea here, I've got one idea here, and I'm interested in how those two ideas are interacting with each other. Okay, so here's a thought, here's a thought. And in music, it would mean essentially, I've got this nursery rhyme type melody. Da, 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 da. Okay, so it's sort of a nursery rhyme sing-songy thing, but I've juxtaposed that with African tribal rhythms, okay, which are very different. And so it's that thing of quite often people will be bringing those two quite different ideas together in one piece of music. That's what a juxtaposition is. Things that don't normally fit together, but I've put them together and now we're seeing how they fit together. Makes sense in that kind of world, but it's not necessarily a word I want to throw into my sermons, where I'm, I don't want to start talking about, well, I'm really interested in the juxtaposition between Paul's theology of servanthood and Paul Tillich's whatever. This is just not language that's super helpful. Might work really well in an essay, doesn't work so well in a sermon. Okay. So as I say, technical words can be helpful if we're using them in a specific way. I'm not saying don't ever use the word juxtaposition as the word that I've chosen to use tonight, but if you do, you would need to spend time saying what that word means and explaining it and then using it appropriately. Because you want to bring people with you. You can't make an assumption that everyone's used to understanding what this word means. I mean, it's like go and talk to kids and ask them what all of the hip young language is, and you'll start going, oh yeah. And kids are all starting, oh yeah, that's my Riz. And it's like, what? It's great. I watch videos where I find out what young people are saying, and then I say them to my children, and I know that I'm using them wrong, and it's hilarious. Anyway, there's been a bunch of those videos online recently. But it's that those language can create barriers at times where you don't know what's going on. So if you don't think everyone's going to be able to understand you, then maybe think twice about whether you're going to use those words. So I think I've already made this point. It's ready. There you go. When writing sentences for a sermon, less is more, meaning shorter sentences. Okay. Broadcasters, as in people who are on the radio, so if you get media training, for example, like if you're in a position in ministry, if you're Anglican, maybe you're a bishop, maybe in the Methodist Church, let's say you become the president of the Methodist Church, you might be in a role where you have to speak to people in public in the media. You might get someone from, the Herald might ring you up asking for a quote. And the thing they teach you in media training is to do what they call talking in sound bites, meaning I have a short, focused sentence that is very clear in what it means, and I'll say that. So when giving an interview, and I've had to do this a couple of times where I've had someone in the media ring up, we're wondering what you could think about that. And it's that thing of the trick is to say, just going to take a second, I'll think what my thought is, and I'll say it as short and snappily as possible. Politicians tend to be very good at this. For example, one that really got up my nose earlier this week, David Seymour, in response to Christian leaders sending him a letter. I was one of the Christian leaders that signed that letter that went that was an open letter to government opposing the treaty principles bill. Anyway, that letter got by, but David Seymour just said something. Church leaders are behaving in a way that's undemocratic. Now, what he said is not true. He's wrong, but he said it short and sharp, and so reporters went, "Oh yeah, okay." David Seymour says church leaders are undemocratic. That gets reported in the media. That got picked up because it was short and sharp, and it made a point, made a sensational point, made an inaccurate point. Because actually everyone in this democracy is allowed to express an opinion. It's not undemocratic to say we don't agree with you. But that's an example of that, that the short, sharp to the point can be very powerful in what people pick up and take away. That's not to say that all of our sentences, that sermons are a bunch of sound bites together, but sometimes, particularly when we're getting towards the end, that wrapping up, that conclusion, to have a very focused, kind of clear sentence that really brings together our ideas is a good thing to say. Sometimes you might say it twice so that people hear it. They go, oh, this was the point. This is the part I need to go away with. So I will do that sometimes. I will have a short sentence, and if I feel it's particularly well focused and it's to the point, I will say it a second time, because it emphasizes it and it instills it in people's memory, and they walk out going, that was the idea. Okay. Any questions about that one? Let's see how many more of these I've got. I've only got a couple more on this section. So I've got one more before we'll have a break. I've kind of covered these points a little bit already. J is for jargon. Jargon. So jargon, let's put it this way. We'll look at the slide first. Okay, jargon. So there you go. This is from the A to Z of being a modern Christian. J is for Jane. Excuse me, can I share my testimony? I've got a real burden on my heart. The person clearly on the other side does not know that you should see a doctor about that. Have you been redeemed? Not recently. Then confess. I put cheese in my tea. Right. The point is that within the church, we have a language that is entirely our own. We talk about spiritual, faith matters, theological ideas in a language that is not part of the real world experience of most people in this country. And that language can be a barrier for people joining and participating and understanding who we are. Have I talked to you about this word redemption before? Have I already made this point? I might have. Have I told the story? Okay, it's a story I tell a lot, so this is I've got to be careful about how many times I repeat myself. Okay, so redemption is a Christian concept, right? Does everyone here feel they know what redemption is? Oh, you're all being cautious because you know there's
Yes, I think so.
Okay, so lots of us have a sense of what the word redemption is, but we don't necessarily know where the word came from or how it came to be part of the Christian tradition. So in the ancient world, enslavement was part of the ancient world. People were owned by other people as property. And if you were enslaved, you had to do whatever it was your owner decided to do with you. Your life was not your own. Now, in some cases, slave owners would decide to emancipate, which is to set free. They would free their slave. They would decide, I no longer want you to be a slave. I will pay the cost to purchase your life back so it is your own again. And there was a process for this. So say you're in a city like Jerusalem, you would go down to the city gates. There would be a bailiff on the city gate whose job, it was a kind of form of taxation that they would set the price. So I would, let's say that I'll make myself the slave in the story rather than the slave owner. That would be better for me. But say my owner takes me down to the city gates and says, I want to set Richard free. He's been a good slave. I want to set him free. And the bailiff would say, well, this is what it costs. And so my owner will pay the cost and they'd sign paperwork and I would be formally freed. I'm now a free person, no longer beholden to my master. I can do what I want. I can go and live my own life. That process was called redemption. The person who was the redeemer was my slave owner. The person who owned me has just redeemed me. They are my redeemer. They have set me free. Okay? So early in Christian theology, there comes this idea of somehow we've had an experience that through experiencing Jesus, it's like, because, imagine, tremendous. But people are starting to think about what is that experience like to have been a person who was enslaved, who is now set free. How good does that feel? To not have had a life that was your own and suddenly to have a life that's your own, to be free. Like that's a great moment in your life. It's a moment of joy, of celebration, of I'm free at last. Like it's an incredible sense, and it's hard for us to get in touch with what that would feel like, right? But essentially, early people in talking about their idea of what Jesus was like begins to think about that experience. It was a common real world experience that some people had, and that somehow this experience of Jesus is that I feel like I'm a slave that's been set free. Something's been taken away. Something is different. I have this sense of joy and newfound freedom that I didn't have before. Now, over time, that gets theologized and more stuff gets layered on top of it. But in the early church, that was really just that idea of going, I have this sense of joy in having come to Christ like a slave who has been set free. So it's really simple to begin with. And then over time, people go, well, if it's like being set free, what have you been set free from? And so later theologians start going, well, if you feel like you've been set free, maybe you've been set free from, oh, I don't know, sin. Okay. That idea gets added onto it. And it starts getting built up over time. And we end up getting quite a long way away from the experience of what that word redeemer meant. So when we say Jesus is my redeemer, it's about that idea of being set free. It's not so much about sin and death or atonement. Those ideas come later in the Christian tradition. Now, again, for lots of people, that is what those meanings are. But you can hear the way I'm sort of talking really carefully through these different ideas, because if I just say Jesus is my redeemer, some people in church are going to go, I don't know what that means. Okay. Some people are going to say, oh, yes, I know that that's like that the Redeemer was the person who set their slave free. So Jesus is a Redeemer. Somehow Jesus has set us free. And there'll be other people who are saying, oh, well, Jesus has set us free from sin because he died on the cross and he died for me. That's another theological position. So all of those different possibilities exist. So when I use that word Redeemer, there are a whole bunch of different experiences that are happening for my listeners. Okay. So the point here is not to use jargon, but to be careful in how we use it. That if I have a specific meaning, if I'm only wanting to talk to, and not to use it blindly. So if I just cast the word around, well, Jesus is our Redeemer, I've added that into prayers or whatever, and I haven't taken any time to explain it, or what I mean, or what my intention in using that word is, then all we have is muddled opinion. We have some people who think I mean this, some people think I mean this. So there's a lack of clarity, okay, if I just use Christian language without taking time to reflect on it or say what it is I mean. So if I'm going to use that word, it's better to talk about the history, talk about where it came from, talk about what I mean, and talk about what my intention in using it is, okay? Because that leads to greater clarity rather than me assuming you're all on the same page as me, because people won't be. There will be a variety. So as I say, and there are lots of words like that in our church thing. And if you're like me and you've been in church basically your entire life, it can be really hard working out at times what those words are. What I'm really appealing to you to think about is, what is it going to be like for that person who, for whatever reason, has said, this Sunday when I'm preaching is going to be the first Sunday I try to come to church. Think about that person when you're writing your sermon. What is their experience of my sermon going to be like? Are they going to find that there's a whole bunch of language and ideas in here that they don't understand and they're not invited to be a part of? Or are they going to find that there's an opportunity to want to explore and engage? And again, I'm not saying we have to do this perfectly every week, but I wish a few more preachers would think about what it's like for that person who's come to church for the first time, and whether our preaching is going to capture that person and invite them to come in closer to the community and ultimately to explore their faith life more deeply. So that's a big thought.
I hear preachers sometimes they want to relate a topic or on what they want to talk or preach about on Sunday. If it's a specific word, they used to do different version of the Bible. That's King James. This is what he said. They said.
Yeah.
And NIV. But basically the same meaning, but two different words.
Yes.
About the same meaning, but it sounds different. And it'll track better in a sense.
Yeah. Yep.
So that's the kind of language that I see some preachers use.
Yep. And that's a good thing to do, because there's a lot of stuff around different translations and why those words are different. Why have different translators made different choices, and what might that be telling us? Like, there's heaps of stuff to explore around that. So yeah, that can be a really effective thing. The other thing that's good about that is because, as I say, sometimes biblical texts are ambiguous, meaning it's not necessary. Like, much as we want to say, I've read this Bible passage. I know what it means. I think, and I'm going to tell everyone what it means. Actually, that's just my opinion of what it means. It can mean lots of different things to lots of different people. And sometimes it's good to actually say, this person has interpreted this passage this way, or this translation is translated a bit differently. Why might that be? And it's a way of bringing those different perspectives in. That's a really good thing to do, because what that's saying is, instead of me saying, I'm going to tell you all what to believe, I'm going to say, you might think about this text a little bit differently to me, and that's okay. Because God and the Spirit, the Spirit of God might be moving in your life differently to how God's Spirit is moving in mine. And there's room for that. That's about an invitational church, right? That's a church where it says, I'm not superior to you. We're on this journey together. And we can learn from each other, and whatever it is that is in terms, I honor what God is doing in your life as much as I trust God is working in my life too. So I think those are good ideas. Yeah, good ideas. Okay, that's the halfway point. We're going to take 5, which I say it's 5. It's always 10. Let's come back at past, everyone. Okay, it's 20 past, so let's come back at past, and then we'll carry on.
Thank you, Richard.
There we go. Preaching in the digital world. So already talked a little bit at the top of the class about how COVID shifted this for a lot of people. Did many of you do, in your experience, did you use things like Zoom for church?
Zoom.
Yep. Okay. So if we had someone do funerals via Zoom, that's hard.
Yeah.
Super hard. I know some churches just recorded their sermons and put them on YouTube, did this sort of thing. My church that I belonged to at the time did a church gathering via Zoom, which was actually really good. Weirdly, our congregation grew during the pandemic, which was very strange, but it was that thing of there was something about it being face to face. And we had a very, very short service. We just did a 30-minute service. So it was kind of morning prayer, had a couple of prayers, a reading, sermon, closing prayers. That was it. It was a very short. And then there would be sort of half an hour, 45 minutes, people just catching up. And lo and behold, there were all sorts of people who hadn't been engaged with our church who suddenly found that actually they really liked that. So keep thinking about that stuff. It's worthwhile. When I was first teaching this course, it was before the pandemic, and most of us didn't use Zoom or have access to it. And when I was talking about digital media, I was primarily talking about things like data projectors. Do churches even have data projectors anymore? My church hasn't got a data projector. We don't even have screens though, but that's because we're unusual. But screens like this, we got the ability to be able to put words up, and various other things. There's more what I had in mind, but it is good to touch on some of those other sort of post-pandemic experiences of using things. It's not a new thing. That's what I've just said. Look, it's on the slide. What am I already doing? I'll just read the slide. But there we go. Multimedia might be a fancy buzzword describing the use of technology for presentations, but multimedia is not a new phenomenon in the church. The way traditionally that churches dealt with the idea of going, what would really help this sermon is a good picture that people can look at and engage with, because some of us are more visual people. Some people listen to things. Some people like to see things. Some people need to talk about things. Some people need to touch and handle things, kinetic learners, okay? So we all have different learning styles. And from time to time, it's good to use that sort of visual opportunity. And the way that this happened in a lot of traditional churches was through depictions of, different uses of art. And the Christian tradition is full of art. And in many churches, that's you might have pictures or paintings or banners. But the thing I always tend to come to is stained glass windows. And this was a form of multimedia presentation before data projectors or screens or any of that stuff existed. This was the way they did it. And if you go around certain older churches, you'll find that, yeah, there are lots of depictions of different things. So if you go into an older church that's got a lot of stained glass, or if you go to the chapel here, okay, wander around and look at what the different windows are, because they're all installed to tell different stories. You know, like in the windows in this chapel, there are the story of, you know, the Melanesian Brotherhood is depicted there, for example, an important connection to this college in this part of the world with Melanesia, for example. I know those windows are there. You also find depictions of different saints. There are also tend to be biblical stories. Jesus speaking to the rich young man, Jesus healing a blind person. You know, these sorts of things come up really often because there was that tradition of every once in a while we will read the story in church, and it means that not only do we have the story, we've got a window there that shows the story too. Now there are limitations to that, of course. Lots of white Jesuses around, like in this picture here. We know Jesus was a Mediterranean man who would not have had blonde hair and white skin in all likelihood. But anyway, these are certainly common depictions in this part of the world. But there are lots of interesting things about it. And as I say, there are lots of things you can learn about stained glass windows. I think, have I talked to you about this one already? I have a little bit, haven't I? Yeah, that's the Holman Hunt picture. So this was a window in my former parish, and it's based on a painting, which was quite a well-known painting, but it got replicated and recreated in glass. And again, there's lots of things woven into it. The idea, it's called Jesus the light of the world. He's holding a lamp, but it's like the light is radiating from him. You can see the darkness of the world behind him. Okay, he's knocking on a door because that's picking up on the biblical passage of, "See, I stand at the door and knock, and if you let me in, I will come and feast with you," and so on. And the idea here is that Jesus is knocking at this door that's sort of overgrown. It's difficult to open this door because of all the plants have grown over the door. But we are the door, and there's no door handle on Jesus' side. Jesus can't open the door. We open the door. We open the door to let Jesus in, is the idea that's being depicted here. Yeah, there's a bat here, again, depicting something about the chaos of the world. There's a piece of fallen fruit. Oh, maybe that's something about original sin. It's all up to there are lots of interpretations and multiple interpretations around these sorts of things. Yeah. Anyway, lots of stuff we can talk about. Every church I've ever been in, where I've preached, I tend to, if I make time, not just to look at stained glass windows. I like looking at stained glass windows. I have a particular interest in that, but it's really good to spend time walking around the church to see whatever there is. Like there might be, as I say, banners that are depicting various things. Lots of churches have banners, and often they have a history to them too. Not only the people who made them, but where they came from. They might have been a group like AAW or a Mothers Union might have made them, and you know there's a history there. So there's lots of these things have stories attached to them, even if what they depict isn't necessarily the most useful thing in the world in terms of preaching. But these are all things that are there. Knowing the story of your church community and how things are. Are there plaques on the wall? Who were these people? Why have they got these memorials in church? Are there war memorials? Is there a register for people who served during? These are common things that we find in lots of our churches. Some churches will have flags taken from warships. Why are those in church? How do we deal with that? People will have donated things. But in the church I grew up in, every pew had been donated by a family. They all had a plaque with the family name on them. You know, who are those people? Because some of them were still around, and you could see there were people who literally still sat in their family pew because that was the pew their family had bought for the church. these are interesting parts of history. They say something about who your community is. So it's always good for us as preachers to get familiar with those things and what are the things that we might be able to draw upon. If we're familiar with a church building and what it contains, it becomes easier to go, oh, there's an opportunity here to talk about this particular thing. I'm going to talk about another stained glass window. So this was also on my former parish. And so this is quite well, there's a lot going on here. We'll take it one panel at a time. So what's this panel depicting? Any guesses?
The
Yeah,
The birth of Christ.
nice and easy, the nativity. So we know that, of course, in the Gospels, the Magi here with their crowns and the shepherds do not actually turn up in the same story. Do we know that? Well, they don't.
No.
The shepherds turn up in the Gospel of Luke. The Magi turn up in the Gospel of Matthew. They don't turn up in the same story. Yet at Christmas time, we sandwich them all together and we call it the Nativity. Those are things worth exploring, but depicted here together. The star, of course. The star, again, turns up in the Gospel of Matthew, doesn't appear in the Gospel of Luke. That's a particular narrative piece of the story that fits in with one tradition but not the other. Again, a stable. Stables don't actually turn up in any of the birth narratives. The word used is kataluma, means the upper room. So there's no room in the upper room, which means it's not a stable, but and we find in the ancient world that it's not an inn, rather. Sorry, it's not an inn. It is a stable. But they say, oh, they slept in the stable because there was no room for them in the inn. Well, the word kataluma means inn. Well, no, it gets translated as inn, but it means the upper room, and it's probably describing, if you go in the ancient world, a cave where there's a sleeping deck above, which is where the people sleep, and the animals sleep below. And the animals actually, the heat of their body provides warmth in winter to, before there were heaters, you had animals that you would keep in the cave to keep them safe, but they'd also provide warmth. And so that word, kataluma, meaning there was no room on the upper deck in the sleeping area, so they slept down below with the animals, makes a different kind of sense, right? We suddenly go, oh, okay, so it maybe wasn't actually quite so terrible. It wasn't that there was no room for them. It was the case of going, there were so many people packed into this cave system, there wasn't actually enough room for this person giving birth to be there with all of the other people who are sleeping in this other small space. So we've got what's going on with this baby? Full head of hair. He looks like a little person, really. What's going on there? What do you think's
It looks like
happening?
he's being crucified.
There you go. Well, is that a little bit of foreshadowing? Yeah. So this is quite common. You'll see this in lots of Christian art, the idea of the baby Jesus already, I am here to be crucified. So, there's a particular theological statement being made there. This would be Mary, Joseph in the background. So this one, obviously a nativity window. Okay. So that's cool. Christmas time, things we can talk about this. Again, crowns, a really interesting thing to pull out of the story. Were they kings? Well, the Gospel of Matthew doesn't describe them as kings at all. The word used is magi, and that doesn't imply royalty at all, but we have a tradition that's been layered over the top about kings. Why do we ascribe the number 3 to them? How many were there? Does the Gospel tell us how many there were?
Yeah.
You're all sitting there and going,
I think so.
we know this is a trap. Richard wouldn't be asking unless I think there are 3 kings. Aren't there 3 kings? I know their names. The kings do traditionally have
Oh,
them.
yeah.
Does anyone know the name of the 3 kings?
It was Balthazar, wasn't there?
Balthazar, that is one.
Were there 4 kings? 4 rings a bell.
Oh, I'll talk about that in a moment. Okay.
Right.
So traditionally, Christian tradition gave the kings names, and they are Belshazzar, Melchior, and Caspar.
That's
All
right.
right. Those are the names of the 3 kings. There is another story that was written in the 20th century called The Fourth Wise Man, and it tells the story of another wise person who also had a gift that they're bringing, who got waylaid for various things, and ultimately turns up and arrives in Jerusalem at the time that of the crucifixion, and that this king, I think, gives whatever his gift is to the person who carries the cross for Jesus, and that's the story. It's an imaginative story. It's not a strong part of the Christian tradition, but it was very popular in the 60s, I believe, that story. So it's done the rounds. It's one that I'm aware of. But yeah, that story's out there. But again, you know, a more recent addition to the Christmas canon. The reason why 3 is because what the gospel, it doesn't name how many magi there are. It says magi came from the east, seeking the newborn king. That's really what it tells. And magi, astrologers, people who are reading signs in the sky, who are coming seeking this newborn king. What the gospel does tell us is that they brought gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So not 3 people, but there are 3 gifts. And so in Christian tradition, that came into, oh, well, each person brought a gift. And so that's why we end up with this number 3. And then Christian tradition develops more and more and more. Again, these are stories about the Christmas tradition, okay? And these are things that come Christmas time, we can unpack those a little bit. What I love about Christmas is that Christmas is a complicated tradition. It's a tradition that says whatever you want to do to celebrate and to add to this tradition, it's welcome. Because the point is that Jesus is born, and your acknowledgement of that celebration is welcome. And that's why we have Christmas trees and tinsel and angels, and all of these other things get layered on over time. And it includes seasonal cookies and roast turkey, and all of these things get added to the tradition. They're not there in the biblical story at all. But they're the things that we have brought to the tradition to add to the celebration. I think actually that's the power of Christmas, is that people have continued to add it and make Christmas their own. And that even includes, Mariah Carey songs, like that's an addition to the Christmas celebration. But actually, as I say, Christmas is a tradition that says, hey, come on in. Okay, I'll jump over the other side. So I'll talk about this panel in the center last. This one here, there should be a giveaway of what day this is celebrating.
The Pentecost?
Yeah, Pentecost. What tells us it's Pentecost?
You've got the apostles there with Christ. Have you got the tongue? Is that the tongues of flame above?
Tongues of flame above their heads. So we see that, tongues of flame above the head.
Oh,
Also, the Holy Spirit up here is a little indicator. Okay. So up there, that tells us this. So for those of us who are Anglican in the room, this is where, there's a liturgical garment that is supposed to look like a tongue of flame. Does anyone know what it is? Something that some people in church wear. Pointed hat?
Is it mitre? No.
Yeah, a mitre. So bishops wear a hat called a mitre, a pointed hat. Okay. And bishops wear it. Only bishops wear mitres, but it's the idea of that is this thing which Anglicans get hung up on called apostolic succession. The idea that, these apostles received the gift of the Holy Spirit, and then when they commissioned more leaders by laying hands on them, and they passed it on to them, and then those people passed it on, and that's passed on through our line of bishops. Okay, so that's why bishops get to wear the silly pointed hat, which represents the flame, as in the flame over the head of the apostles. That's our tradition. There you go. Don't have to like it or agree with it, but that's where the tradition comes from.
Richard, I notice in Melanesia and in some parts of Asia and Africa, they're really fond of the red mitre, and in particular the ones that display the Holy Spirit and the tongues of flame, and they're quite eccentric looking, that's for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, they've become other things and more ornate and so on, but red really was the traditional color, because it's that association with flame, because that is what they are designed to depict. So anyway, it's a fun thing to do with Sunday school kids at Pentecost, is to get them all to make mitres and wear them. And if you're lucky, you have a bishop visiting, and it just makes them stressed out, which is fun. Sorry. Richard's 101 in how to wind up a bishop. Okay, so the central battle here we have. Now this is actually twofold. There are two sort of interpretations. So again, people who have created this, not quite understanding what tombs were like in the ancient world, have done a tomb more akin to what you might have found in this part of the world in the last century, where tombs were sort of level on the ground with a hole underneath, whereas we know that the tomb that Jesus was laid in was probably much more like a cave. The sleeping guards, there's a whole story about that and how that came into the narrative, but I won't worry too much about that now. The idea of Jesus rising out of the tomb. So obviously an Easter Day depiction. The guards are asleep, Jesus is rising out of the tomb. So yeah, and we've got the crosses in the background. So yes, we can say, oh, it's an Easter window, it's a resurrection window. But that's if we're reading it from in this direction, where we start at the bottom and we read up and we go, oh, okay, so that's Jesus rising up out of the tomb. But there's another way we can read it, where we can say, oh, there's a crown here. What's this light here? Oh, that's right, with these clouds and light bolts, it's a depiction of heaven, that which is above us, of the Jesus is King of Kings, the ruler who is unlike the rulers of the world, who is superior in every way and didn't come to dominate us, but rather showed us how to lead. And that example was to lead through service to others. So that's there. And if we read it from this direction down, we say, actually, it's Jesus rising into heaven, which is a depiction of ascension in the tradition of Jesus rising into heaven after the resurrection. So both of those 2 points are tied together, but actually it's doing both things. It's a resurrection window and it's an ascension window. Both things are going on. So again, just this one wall, whole bunch of different stories, different things we can point out and talk about in each of them. And if you study them in detail, you'll find more things that you can talk about. I've spoken about that enough. The other great thing, of course, is that with modern technology, with data projectors and screens and these sorts of things, or even if just a good quality printer, we're able to provide people with photos and other images as things that we can talk about in our preaching. And I've talked about some of these pictures, but I'll tell you a little bit about this one. Any guesses where this is from?
Jordan.
Is it the Jordan?
It is indeed. It is the Jordan River. Quite a grotty piece of water. You notice that?
The right place that Jesus.
Yeah.
What we would say is that this is a traditional site. We don't know the exact spot where Jesus is. We are told that Jesus was baptized in the Jordan, and this is the Jordan River. So yeah, you can see the water quality too. I'll talk about this. Tricky. Yeah. So this is Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan, and this is Israel, Palestine on this side. And you can see there's a fence, so you can go into, but you can't swim across and go into the other side. And these are border security over the other side. All right. Yeah, so you can't swim across the river and enter another country. Yeah. Yeah, this water is pretty feral. Anyway, I've got a bunch of stories I'll tell you, but I'll tell you about one. So obviously, there's a story about baptism that connects here. Jesus baptized in the Jordan by John. Obvious story. That's the connection here. This is what it actually looks like today, right? I made this comment about the water quality. It's pretty terrible. If you head up this direction up the river, you head all the way north, you get to the Sea of Galilee. All right, the Sea of Galilee, which is a freshwater lake, although interestingly, it has salt water down beneath it. And the way there are saltwater springs in the Sea of Galilee, and there's water, because water is heavy, water has weight, right? Like, if you fill up a bucket of water, it weighs more. So the weight of the fresh water is enough that it keeps the salt water pressed down so that the salt water doesn't come up and poison it all. But if the Sea of Galilee was to drop below a certain level, it would lose that weight, and the springs with the salt water would spring up and poison all of it, would turn it all to salt water. And this is a problem because, the Sea of Galilee is a really important resource, primarily for Israeli settlements. And in fact, the Israeli government have worked out, because they're ever growing and the population is growing, they take the maximum amount of water out of the Sea of Galilee because they need it for the growing population. So they take the maximum amount of water and they get down to the absolute minimum, that if it drops any lower, they'll lose the entire water source. It'll become salt water and they'll lose the whole lot. So they're taking huge amounts of water out of the Sea of Galilee in order to give water to people who are essentially living in what's otherwise a desert. Okay. So what that means is, because the maximum amount of water is getting taken out of the lake that feeds this river, there is less and less water traveling down the river. And without flowing water, what happens to a river? Yeah, it stagnates, it dies. So we'll get to that in a sec. So the river is stagnating. It's no longer fresh and clean because there's not enough water traveling down it, because all the water is getting siphoned off further up the river. Okay. At the other end, if you travel all the way down in this direction, down the river, you get to the Dead Sea. All right. And the Dead Sea is completely salty, unbelievably salty. So much so that you swim in it for too long, you actually start melting a little bit because it's so saline. When you swim in it, you come out and your skin feels soapy because it's basically melted off all your dead skin. Anyway, bit gross, but there you go. The Dead Sea is shrinking. And in fact, it's predicted that it might disappear in the next 20 years because it's not being fed. So the Dead Sea, which is the lowest lying body of water in the world, is significant, is shrinking and disappearing because it's not getting enough water down. So this picture tells a whole lot of stories. It tells stories about a border which is contested between Jordan and Israel. It tells the story of where Jesus was baptized. It tells the story of a political climate and a system which is largely unjust, and how it's having a very physical, a huge environmental impact on what's been one of the great taongas, actually, in this part of the world. So lots of complicated things going on there. So this is the point, right, is that a picture can convey a heck of a lot of stories and bring those stories to life in a way that just me talking about the River Jordan isn't going to do it in quite the same way. Being able to see and connect can be helpful for lots of us, right? So that's why it's good to think about these things. So as I say, a picture is worth, as the phrase goes, a picture is worth 1,000 words, is the expression. I think I've spoken to you about this picture before as well. Depicting the Last Supper, the darkness of the world, the light emanating from Christ, friends gathered. There's lots of things going on here that can connect us to the story. And so all sorts of art and things are available. Heck, I mean, the next big adventure for people is that, AI images, which people can be able to create. Really, you might have an idea for something that's going to help bring a sermon to life, and you can actually just go and create an entirely new image, which you'd be able to share with people. Right, we'll press on. So if a picture is worth 1,000 words, what might a video be worth? Now, bear in mind, I don't really advocate for using videos too much in sermons because that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting for us, and it's our job to do the speaking. But sometimes videos can be really helpful, and certainly as a teaching resource in other parts of our ministry, videos are a great thing. I've got another video. It's another video about storytelling and a different person's perspective on it. So we're going to revisit that. I wish I'd found it earlier on in the course, but I found it now, and it's it's a good thing. And as I say, sometimes short video clip can be really helpful in preaching. There are lots of very short, pithy ideas out there. Different groups that have put things out. I had a friend in the UK who was just doing little video kind of thoughts for the day things that were really great. I can remember she did one on just reflecting on your bank balance and saying, what does your bank balance tell you about what your priorities are? And for her, and it was really lighthearted, but it was like, She's going, but my bank balance tells me that instead of making cups of coffee at home, I'm really dependent on going to the cafe next door to my parish office. And that actually that's a whole lot of money that I could be using in a better way. And that when I added it up over this many weeks, that was money I could have given to something far more valuable because I could actually just make my coffee at home a lot cheaper. So it was just a little, thought around how we use our resources and where giving can happen and so on. So there are lots of fun things like that. Anyway, this is a video from
Hey, Pete.
Pixar.
How's it going?
You know what? I'm having a really bad day.
What happened?
See, what Val's saying when she says, what happened is, tell me a story. And that's actually what this season of Pixar in a Box is all about. To make a movie here at Pixar takes years, but it all starts with a story. Humans have been telling stories since we could speak, probably even before. We tell stories around the campfire. We write plays, we write novels, short stories, we make movies, we take photographs on Instagram, the list goes on. The power of story is that it has an ability to connect with people on an emotional level. One of the things you hear all the time, this advice, is write what you know. Now, as a kid, I was like, I don't want to write about suburban Minnesota, that's boring. I want to write about explosions and monsters and car chases. Well, what that actually means is, yeah, go ahead and write about monsters and explosions and car chases, but put something into it that talks about your own life, how you feel. Do you feel scared? Do you feel alone? Something from your own life will make that story come alive and not just be a boring car chase. When I started directing Monsters Incorporated, the way I would pitch it is, it's about a monster who scares kids for a living. That's his job. He clocks in, he clocks out, he eats donuts and talks about union dues, and we thought that was a pretty funny idea, and sure enough, when I would tell it to people, they would smile. But when we told the story as a film, people started getting bored and restless, and they're like, I don't understand what this movie's about. Well, what I finally figured out was that it's actually not about a monster who scares kids. It's about a man becoming a father. And that was what was happening to me. So why write about what you know? Well, it's because probably what happened to you made you feel some particular way. And what you're trying to do really when you tell a story is to get the audience to have that same feeling. One of the big revelations for me telling stories is how much work they are, really. I always thought you'd just tell the story once and it would be perfect, and geniuses like Walt Disney or Miyazaki, this brilliance comes out of their head once and there it is. Well, the truth is, our stories don't always come out exactly perfectly the first time, or the second time, or the third time, or the fourth time, up to the 30th time. And so you keep going again and again and again, and only after retelling the story many, many times does it really sparkle. This season of Pixar in a Box is about how we at Pixar tell our stories, in hopes that it will inspire you to tell yours.
But seriously, what happened?
So the first thing, I get to my desk, right? It's 8 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, so that's just a cool resource I found. Lots of us know Pixar films. Yeah, I challenge you to go and watch the film Up and not cry in the first 5 minutes of it like I did anyway. Yeah, so lots of good insight around storytelling and drawing people in, and but this here I've used in class just as an example of there are lots of amazing resources out there that we can find that might tap in, and sometimes a short video clip might actually just be a helpful thing. It is something that we can do. Creating your own video clips can be a fun thing if you have the ability to do that too. Like when a particular place where I've used that, for example, is if I've run something like a youth group camp, for example. Really great thing to do is to get photos, get video footage, whatever. Like if in this day and age, if you've got young people, they've all got phones of their own. They'll take video clips, and you can get that stuff, put it together, put it before your congregation, and it says a lot. It draws people into a different experience. So yeah, this is Richard's exercises in PR for youth ministry. Right. Moving on, but just think about those. The point here is that technology enables a lot of things in preaching that we wouldn't traditionally have been able to do. And one of the key things is that we have this ability to draw from parts of life way outside our experience of church and actually bring them into church through using technology. And again, I wouldn't advocate for this every Sunday, every sermon. It can become, like anything that we do too much of, it can become a crutch. It can become, oh, this is just the easy thing I do now. But sparingly, it can be a really good thing. Just a couple more points, and we are going to finish early. There we go. So a different take on the use of technology around public speaking and preaching and stuff is this book by this guy, Gar Reynolds. It's really helpful. He spends a lot of ideas around how to use digital technology well. And he's got a whole bunch of useful pointers around how to do that. Now, the nice thing is he also has a website where a lot of this material is available, which is called presentationzen.com. I have put a link on the Moodle page, so you can go and click it and have a look and dig around some of his blog posts if you're interested in that. There are just a couple of really basic things that he talks about, which I really appreciate. I mean, you'll notice, and I mean, I'm not upholding my slides show use as the greatest by any sense, but there are a couple of things I do quite intentionally when I'm teaching. And one example of this, and this is coming from this idea of Presentation Zen, is if you are making a slideshow, it's much better to use lots of slides than to cram a ridiculous amount of material into a single slide. Okay, seriously, look how small the type has become because I decided to put far too much information on this single page. This is a total mistake because if I want people to read something on a slide, then they need to be able to see it. And given that some people in church always choose to sit as close to the back of the church as possible, they're going to have a very hard time seeing any of this. Basically, putting this amount of text on one slide has rendered my use of this technology completely and utterly pointless. We've got quite a big screen in here, but you know, if you're sitting a few more rows back, further away, it becomes impossible. This is the first mistake I see with people doing presentations when I go to conferences and stuff that drives me crazy. I've got an entire speech and I'm going to put it all on 3 slides. No. Small amounts of text are okay, but the key point that's always made in the art of Presentation Zen is small amounts of text might be okay, but pictures will always be better. And his point is that maybe not this picture, but if you think about what I did earlier, is that, you know, again, I took a picture and we talked about it. And this is more effective than having huge amounts of words and notes. Okay. I'm giving you the notes. I'm telling you what it's about, right? This is a more effective use of technology than just putting up text. Now, sometimes in the classroom, we need text. Okay, you need points, you need things I need to have so that you can go back and read your notes later and go, oh, what was going on? As opposed to, well, Richard showed us these 6 stained glass windows. I have no idea what any of those are about now. Okay, so sometimes some notes are helpful, but when we're preaching, the idea of technology is well-chosen, simple pictures can enhance what we're saying. That's the idea. Will this enhance what I'm saying, or is it going to take away from it? If it enhances, then it's worthwhile considering. And especially if we're talking about things like, I mean, I think an earlier one I showed you earlier in the course was the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. You know, seeing that can really help us reimagine the story of the Good Samaritan in a really different way, because we now have an image of where it really happened that can, you know, give us a different experience of that story and help and be memorable in a way. So I can do that by showing that to you rather than just talking about it. So maybe that's an enhancement of talking about a story that we're all very, very familiar with. Whereas just writing up a whole bunch of bullet points, that might work for some people, but it's not necessarily going to be super engaging. Any questions about any of that stuff? Pretty simple stuff. As I say, the use of technology, I do like it. I think having technology and being able to use it on occasion is really great. And particularly when we're doing things like, if you are back in that position of using Zoom and so on, again, rather than just looking at having some pictures that complement a sermon can be a really positive thing to do. Yeah, because it can draw it, make it alive for us in a different way.
Do you recommend it for preaching?
Sorry?
Would you recommend it for preaching?
My honest answer is I think it's good to do sometimes, not all the time. Yeah, that's definitely my thought, is that every once in a while a really good image can really help. Yeah, I mean, I think I put up, I showed you the picture of the labyrinth way back earlier in the course and talked about the symbol and all the, like, you can do that when you see it. And I can talk about the symbols, and you can talk about the cross shape and the circle shape and the spiral. Like, when you see it, it's really, if I was just to describe it, I don't have good enough language to describe it if you've never seen one before. So if I'm going to talk about something, like finding a way to put it in front of someone is going to be more effective than not, because some things are visual. Some things you're going to understand it by looking at it. Lots of us have good imagination, but that's actually not everyone. You know, some people just, it's going to be easy to see it. So I think it depends on what you're doing. But to use it sometimes is a good thing and helpful. I mean, certainly the standard in academic teaching these days is if you don't have a bunch of slides that you're presenting, then you're kind of not doing it right in a sense. Because again, it's that thing of recognizing that some people are very good at listening and taking things in that way. Some people prefer to read. Some people want to watch something. Some people want to, as I say, the tactile learners, that's the really hard one. That's the one we don't cater for in preaching at all, really. I mean, sometimes the thing we might need to do for people who engage that way is to say, hey, that was a big idea. Why don't you talk to the person next to you and ask them what they think? Now, you do that in an Anglican church and everyone freezes up and is terrified because no one wants to talk to their neighbours. I mean, I hate to say it, but, you know, it's true. They were, what? Especially in the churches I belong to, where everyone's very introverted. But there'll be some people who that's the way they learn and engage, is by talking backwards and forwards. So sometimes we need to just do things a little bit differently. Okay, that's all I have on this stuff for tonight. So do we have any other questions or thoughts or points of clarification before we call it a night?
Just an observation, Richard. Traveling a bit for work as I do, you will often be in a small town or, you know, outside of Auckland, and so you'll go along on a Sunday morning to a small Anglican parish, and where there is no Anglican service, sometimes to the Catholic or the Methodist service. And I'm noticing even in small towns and in small parishes or congregations, the use of something visual on a screen is becoming more and more common. I don't know if it's necessarily popular, but yeah, it seems even in smaller congregations where the congregation might be kind of the sort of 50 plus age demographic, it seems to be really popular, and maybe that's just a gradual acceptance of the use of technology, but yeah, maybe that's the new way of doing things in most places. And you know, I think back to my grandparents who were old school Catholics. If you know, a data projector back in the 1990s was a huge abomination, but in most Catholic parishes these days, they're really common, and there will be a really beautiful, engaging image, not necessarily something sort of particularly artful or pious, but something that has something to offer the common punter in the pew.
Yeah. And thinking about the other end of the spectrum, I mean, I see this with my kids at school, that the amount of, like, even for my youngest daughter, who's 8 and is at primary school, the amount of screen time is amazing. That when I was a kid, mat time meant that you sat there, and if you were lucky, the teacher might read you a story. You know, this was what mat time in primary school was. Whereas I see their teachers, you know, teaching songs, they, you know, they'll have a 2-minute video clip on a screen there. You know, it's dynamic and different, and Yeah, well, I wish I went to school when my kids were going to school. I just think it looks a lot more fun. And it's not just the entertainment. I think the level of teaching and what they're able to draw into that experience of teaching. Because I can definitely remember those times as a kid where teachers would describe things and it would just go over the head. It was outside of my experience. But being able to show, a 2-minute video clip of, this is what the Olympics is about. Like we've just had the Olympics, right? All the kids at primary school have been doing units on the Olympics. My daughter's class, for some reason, they drew the country Norway to be support, and through using that technology, they were able to learn all sorts of things that they wouldn't otherwise have known, and that wouldn't have been easy to learn. As I say, going back 20 years ago, before this technology was easy and accessible. So, as I say, I mean, there are rough edges to it. There is that thing of like, look, honestly, just because someone has said something on the internet does not mean that it's true. We do need to be discerning. Not all material out there is good material. And we should always, just because AI is out there as a thing, we shouldn't just check our brains out and not be discerning in the things that we use, and still use our skills to actually check things and go, is this right, and so on. I'm sure lots of us have had that experience of people going, I've done the research, meaning I've done a Google search and I found out some terribly untrue things. It happens to lots of us where we get, so we still need to use that level of engagement and to think critically about things, about what is, as I say, when it comes to your sermons, knowing something already and checking it on Wikipedia is one thing, and going, but I did this just today where I was like, I have this thought because I've got to preach on St. Matthew in a week's time. And I had a thought and I checked on Wikipedia, and like 2 of the things that they said I looked at instantly were like, well, that's not true. That's really out of date. I've got the Anchor Bible Dictionary here. It says something quite different. So you do have to be discerning. Yeah. But you're right. There's a huge opportunity in using this technology and using it well as well. So again, the goal is to enhance things that we have, and not as a crutch, but as a way that we can draw some broader things in that we wouldn't be able to otherwise. Yeah.
One really clever sermon I saw a few years back. It was a particular Sunday where the Catholic parishes throughout the country, and I was just at Mass with my parents who are still practicing Catholics, and it was a small Māori Catholic congregation in the far north, and it was a particular Sunday where the priests were prompted to talk about the papal encyclical on environmental stewardship. And so the priest showed an episode of one of David Attenborough's documentaries on the destruction of South American rainforests, and it was just the perfect combo. It really hit a note.
Yeah, no, that's tremendous. Yeah. No, tremendous. Believe it or not, I have used David Attenborough clips during the season of creation myself. So like, I'm definitely warm to that. Because that's the thing, right? If there's expertise out there in the world that's combined with something that looks amazing and like, how is that bad? I mean, that's a wonderful thing to be able to draw on. And we've done it with all sorts of other things throughout Christian history. We do it with music all the time and never think twice about it. So again, visual art is something that we can draw in really rich and life-giving ways, I think. So yeah, I commend it to you as an idea, but again, wouldn't do it all the time, but there is an opportunity there if you have the technology and the ability to do it, that can be really positive. So we're going to call it a night. I'll post the video tomorrow in all likelihood, and we'll be back next week. So again, St. John students, you can sidestep next week. You don't need to be here. We'll be on Zoom. For everyone else, I will put a note out tomorrow. So I'll post the video. I'll put a note out. Just remind us we'll do Zoom next week, and reminding everyone that. And we'll see you. The rest of you will all be back together in 2 weeks' time. Okay.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you.